Good morning again, Franciscans. It is a joy to celebrate Easter with you today, even at this little distance. Now, I'm an immigrant to Arizona from California, and Californians know earthquakes. Arizonans, not so much. Until this spring, when suddenly the whole world is being shaken by the coronavirus earthquake. So, when you experience earthquakes, you learn it's not just the earthquake. You also have got to deal with the aftershocks. So here we are on a glorious Easter morning. The Lord is risen, but we can't celebrate fully because of the aftershocks. For survival, we have to remain socially separated. No choir, no hugs, but at least lilies and hymns are helping us to rejoice even in this mean season. Now, I received an email that proposed an elegant solution for this unseasonable Easter. It's a solution which excited me because it makes so much sense. Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, emailed, "This year, the date of Easter falls right in the middle of the most deadly month of the virus. We must remain isolated. We can't go anywhere. There's not much to celebrate. Let's move the date of Easter about 4 weeks to May 10th, when the worst will have passed and we may be able to gather in church again." Archbishop Welby contacted the Pope with this proposal, inviting the Pope to use his authority to bind and loose all things on earth to join him in transferring the date of Easter just for this crisis year 2020. Well, that proposal made so much sense to me that I emailed our bishop, Jennifer Riddall, proposing that she think about adopting this postponement for our diocese and assuring her of my support. Bishop Riddall got right back to me with a full explanation about why the date of Easter is non-negotiable and identifying the email I had read as an April Fool's Day prank. I was snookered, hook, line, and sinker, by a proposal which still makes very good sense to me. I do still long for a Sunday to come when we will all gather to rejoice that this pandemic is passing. But today, here we are, dealing with aftershocks, and in our uncomfortable constraints, observing Easter in the time of coronavirus. Nevertheless, we're not the first to suffer at Easter. St. John reports in his Gospel that at Jesus' crucifixion, there was a real geophysical earthquake. The curtain hanging in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split apart, the graves opened, and many of God's people who had died were raised to life. So we know that for his followers, Jesus' death was an emotional trauma with far-reaching physical and spiritual consequences. Something we learn about earthquakes early on is we've got to anticipate aftershocks. In October 1989, Sylvia and I had just been married for a few months. My parish was in the Santa Cruz Mountains in California, just 6 miles from Loma Prieta, which was the epicenter of a magnitude 7.1 earthquake. It happened just after 5 p.m., and up at Candlestick Park, a few miles up the road, San Francisco Giants fans were filing into the stadium for a World Series game when the force of that earthquake separated sections of the bleachers by more than 20 feet and then closed them again. Every house in Santa Cruz County lost its chimney, which is a $10,000 item and just about the amount of the deductible on your homeowner's policy. In our house, The rafters cracked, the bookshelves and their contents fell, the cupboards flew open, and all our wedding china and crystal crashed into piles of sand, and the refrigerator emptied its contents across the kitchen floor. It was a nightmare. The aftershocks went on for months, day and night. Often they were greater than magnitude 5. What really surprised me after the Loma Prieta earthquake were the emotional aftershocks. There was a woman in the choir who remembered her high school sweetheart. She'd forgotten him. In the early 1960s, he was a high school senior when she was a sophomore. And when he graduated and went on to college, they kept in touch. Then she heard nothing for a long time. Months went by. One day, his mother phoned her to say she was sad to report that her son had dropped out of touch with this girl because he had volunteered to serve in Vietnam. And now word had come back that he had been killed there. His mother went on to say it was especially hard for her to make this call because her son had hoped to return and marry this woman, and the mother thought that they were especially well suited for one another. Can you even imagine receiving that call? This woman, a high school student, couldn't even grasp what she was hearing. Her way of coping was to close off all memory of that sweetheart. She literally forgot not only his death, but his very existence as well. Forgot him for more than 20 years until that earthquake shook the memory loose. From that time, she was able to face her loss, to grieve and to cope and to heal. One more story. Another parish member, barefoot at the moment of the earthquake, grabbed her small children from the house and fled into the front yard. She was still there, terrified, when her husband drove in from work a few minutes later. She called to him to bring her shoes because she was afraid of broken glass in the house, but he ignored her, hurrying in to survey the interior damage of the house. Later, she reflected, I realized in that moment that he didn't love me the way I thought he did. She considered divorce, but they continued to talk. They decided to sell their home and move into the city, closer to his work, where he could commute less and spend more time with his family. The earthquake provided a glimpse into their relationship, but the aftershock was the reflection that gave insight and meaning and led to a plan for response. We can't avoid being shaken by life's earthquakes, but if we keep our minds and hearts open, we may learn something valuable, something God-given, and even life-changing from the aftershocks. Today, St. John gives us an account of the Easter earthquake. The tomb is empty. John's account is so filled with the coming and going of the witnesses at the tomb that the appearance of Jesus is almost incidental. Look at what's happening with these disciples at the tomb. First, we have Peter and the disciple Jesus loved, who hear the news, the grave is empty. They brush aside the woman who has brought them the news and race to the tomb. The beloved disciple is faster, but at the entrance, Peter is bolder. And these are the guide details, indications of competition. From the empty tomb, they race back to be the first with their scant news. He's gone. Now contrast this account by the men on the one hand with the story of Mary Magdalene on the other. Mary was ignored when she first brought news that the tomb was empty. And then she's ignored again as she returns to the tomb somewhere behind the men. It sounds as if the disciples just left Mary behind. There's no mention of them urging her to join them as they plan what to do next in light of the empty tomb. So we can picture her standing there, watching them leave, knowing that she's been forgotten. Is this to be her future, left behind by Jesus and now by her friends in the faith? Sometimes when you're left waiting, it's because God has something special for you to see. Be still and know that I am God. That's what Mary did Easter morning. She was still. She waited around. In waiting and looking a little further into the tomb, there was an aftershock. She noticed two beings. When she lets them see her crying, gripped in her grief, they turn out to be angels. Funny how that can happen. Angels who ask, "Why are you weeping?" As if there were a reason not to weep after such a loss. And when she turns to address the gardener, there's another aftershock. She's speaking to Jesus himself. His body is changed, but the relationship is still there. It's astonishing how much God can say to us when we make the time to listen. Let's confess that usually in hearing this resurrection text, we Christians move plenty quickly ourselves. We rush through the story to get to the big Easter finish. We skip over the boring details like who saw whom so that we can get to the good part. But where are we going in such a hurry? This story is all about the details, like who saw whom. Let's face it, the disciples left too fast on Easter. They felt the earthquake, but they neglected the aftershocks. They missed a life-changing, tear-drying encounter with the Lord. Some of you will recall the name of Don Bowles. He was an investigative reporter for the Arizona Republic newspaper. And back in the 1970s, while investigating mob activity in the Phoenix area, he was blown up by a bomb placed under his car. Don had a notable brother named Richard. Richard Bowles was an Episcopal priest, fired from his first job on the staff of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. He was shocked and pained to be fired, and of course he was anxious not to have income. With his pain and anxiety, his prayer life took on a new urgency. And as he prayed, he felt led to stay focused on employment issues. He realized that hiring practices and interviews are all designed to the advantage of the employer. And he designed strategies to give employees a broader vision of their careers and more control of their job search. Today, these insights and strategies are used by millions of job seekers through Bowles' book, which is still updated every year. It's called "What Color is Your Parachute?" Richard Bowles didn't run away from his earthquake straight into another job just like the last one. Instead, he waited in that pain and dislocation until aftershocks of insight redeemed his suffering, transformed his own career, and brought new hope and help to millions of employees. We can't avoid being shaken by life's aftershocks, but if we keep our minds and hearts open, we may learn something valuable and life-changing from the aftershocks. This is the word of the Lord on Easter. Don't you be so caught up in life's earthquakes that you miss their aftershocks of revelation. Take time in the morning to give your day to God in prayer. Then take some moments at bedtime to reflect on the day just passed, to recognize where God has been present all along, where prayers have been answered, where grace has smoothed the way and so that when at last we're able to come together again to give thanks for Jesus' resurrection, you and I and all of us together will truly be ready to proclaim, Alleluia, the Lord is risen.